Hello. Oh. Uh, Thank you that joined our seminar today. We are very happy because today we have with us Sara Farris. She will give a talk on the title of her talk is Feminism from the Kitchen Floor on the Domestic Workers Erasure Feminism. I suppose you know who is she. Has wrote extensively on the relationship on the far right and the feminist and Marxism and feminist topics. Today, she will give a talk on her recent research on house workers. Please. The floor is yours.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So really, thank you. I want to thank, first of all, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation for having me today, and George and Rosa in particular, who organized this seminar, and I know this cycle of seminars. So really, it's great to be here with all of you. You maybe, as George said, you might be maybe familiar with some of my work on feminationalism, which discusses the mobilization of feminist rights, particularly in some European countries. I'm not going to talk about that today, but if you have questions about that, I am very happy to answer. Also because, you know, as you will see, maybe those who know a little bit that work on feminationalism, what I'm going to do today actually builds on that work, and particularly on the part that relates to the role of care workers and domestic workers in those issues of mobilizations of women's rights by the nationalist right. But I really want to focus today specifically on domestic and care workers. And the reason for that is that, I mean, for many years, just to tell you a little bit about my trajectory, for many years, now it's really since even before my PhD, I started working on migrant domestic workers. So I did research on migrant women from Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Peru in Italy. I'm from Italy. And I was always really fascinated in a way, by really the trajectories and the migrant patterns of these women. But what anyone who works on migration, and particularly migrant women, learns very quickly is that migrant women really, in the majority of European countries, and I would say in the majority of the world really, global south and global north, end up working as domestic workers. This is what is really the reality for the majority of, I'm talking obviously about poor working class women from the global south, even moving from global south to global south. So what, just to say, there is a long history behind this current research, and what I will try to discuss with you today is a recent research project, a pilot project that I did just a few months ago, and I hope is just the beginning of a more extended research project on domestic workers and care workers in an analysis in terms of feminism and class. But I want to tell you a little bit more clearly what I mean by this. Because domestic workers, what I find particularly concerning and interesting is that this is a category of workers that have been erased from two very important movements of the 20th and 21st century, the workers' movement and the feminist movement. When we talk about these workers, usually, or when we talk about the feminist movement, these workers do not appear as part of the story, and the same can be said about the labor movement. Usually we think about the labor movement as a male movement, manual labor, working class, working in factories, but we don't think about domestic workers as belonging and being part of these pictures. So this is really what I'm interested in, understanding why is that the case. So on the one hand, you know, studies on class have historically really crossed out care and domestic workers from their analysis. Notoriously, both Karl Marx and E. Thompson did not include the female servants in their description of the English working class, in spite of the fact that this was the most prevalent job for working women in the 19th and early 20th century, and that their numbers were very high. And even more recently, while contemporary scholars of social class have included new categories such as the precariat to account for the important changes brought about by neoliberalism in terms of contract typologies, income, as well as forms of mobilization and class consciousness. So even though, obviously, the precariat has been such an important category, and these workers are very precarious for sure, domestic and care workers continue to be either ignored or subsumed under other class categories that do not fully account for their specificity. On the other hand, servants and domestic workers also have been erased from the history of the feminist movement, in spite of their important presence and contributions. The relationship between feminists and domestic workers has long been debated in feminist and gender studies. In the early 90s, it became clear that domestic workers was not a seemingly pre-capitalist profession in decline, but rather a growing sector employing particularly working class, migrant, and racialized women. In the global north, while increasing numbers of women enter the labor market, they have sought to outsource domestic tasks, such as cleaning, childcare, and daily care, to other, often migrant women, thereby contributing to the growth of domestic workers and the so-called feminization of migration. Now, given that women's participation in the labor market and their economic independence was one of the main demands of first and second wave feminism, scholars began to question whether feminists had unwittingly created a system where the liberation of one group of women implicitly depended on the exploitation of another group of women. So the question was, for example, how do self-identifying feminists hiring domestic workers reconcile it with their commitment to free all women from traditionally feminized roles and exploitative working conditions? And how do domestic workers experience their working conditions? So the large majority of studies and research have explored all the ways in which feminists respond or ignore to the contradictions in outsourcing of domestic roles to other women, or they have explored the domestic workers' conditions, particularly migrant women, given their significant presence within our global cities. So my current research project, this is really the premise, if you like, is fundamentally driven by the desire to address these two forms of erasure and to understand what it would mean instead to bring the domestic workers' movement fully into the family picture of the workers' movement and the feminist movement. So I want to tell you a little bit more about really how Marx, E.P. Thompson, why they didn't include domestic workers as part of the working class in a context in which they were studying the working class, the features of the working class, and this category of workers represented really the majority of workers in Britain in those years. On this, British historian Laura Schwartz has done really a remarkable job in reconstructing this neglect of domestic workers from the history of class. So, for example, in his account of the British working class, Marx declared that servants, that was the name of domestic workers back then in the 19th century. So for Marx, servants were of no interest to those seeking to mobilize the working class as a revolutionary force and agent of history. So in Capital Volume 1, for example, he wrote that, and here I'm quoting, types of work that are consumed as services and not products separable from the worker are of microscopic significance when compared with the mass of capitalist production and may therefore be neglected. Yet in the 19th and early 20th century, to exclude servants from this political project was to exclude the most numerous of all waged workers. Marx acknowledged that the 1861 census of England and Wales recorded something like 1,200,000 domestic servants out of a potential workforce of about 8 million, outnumbering all the various forms of industrial workers put together. So to neglect servants was also to ignore the vast majority of the female workforce, since, as Marx himself remarked in some of his footnotes, more than 91% of these huge populations of servants were women. So we are talking about really a discussion about the working class in which these women were absolutely not acknowledged, these women workers. As you know, I mean, there is obviously a theoretical reason. For Marx, these were unproductive workers. Unproductive, it was not a value judgment. It simply meant that they were not productive in a capitalist sense. They didn't produce surplus value for Marx because they produced use values. They didn't produce commodities that could be sold on the market. But obviously, we can have a discussion about why, even so, these workers could not belong to the working class, to this category of workers. And there was also, when you read Marx and Engels describing servants, they were also quite suspicious. So, for instance, Marx and Engels thought, and they were inheriting these thoughts from previous writers, they thought that servants were too close to the enemy in a way. They were too close to the bourgeoisie. They were too close to these parasites. And in that sense, he thought they were somehow even absorbing some lifestyle ambitions of these of their employers. So in that sense, there was also a kind of, if you like, portrayal of these workers as not entirely integrated into the project, the revolutionary project of the working class. In the case of E.P. Thompson, which you might know, he's the author of The Making of the English Working Class, which is a very important book for those who work on class, the history of the working class. And it's very important because Thompson proposed a relational vision of class, so class as relationship instead of a thing. So even though Thompson acknowledged that next to agricultural workers, servants were the largest single group of working people during the whole period of the Industrial Revolution, he did not examine their place in the class struggle. So again, we have these massive pieces of work in which these workers, which, as I said, were very significant, and the majority of them were women, were completely neglected. Even today, 150 years later, or more actually, domestic workers are still not really part of class analysis. Of the nearly 200,000 respondents to the Great British Classes Survey that was done in 2013, none of those who responded to this massive survey done in Britain was working as a domestic worker, even though they actually constitute almost 5% of the entire workforce. So we are talking about something like 1,500,000 cleaners. So it's not just domestic workers working as employees in private households. We are talking also about cleaners more generally. But we also know from empirical research that very often even cleaners in offices also work as domestic workers, often in the black market. So we are talking about a very significant percentage of workers. So even though, again, even in today's Britain, these workers are a very significant presence in the workforce, they are neglected when it comes to discussing class. Now, I told you until now some of the if you want a little bit the history in the narrative of the workers' movement in Marx, in Thompson, and a little bit today as to why these workers have been neglected from these histories. Now, it's not very different when we look at the history of the feminist movement. What I mean by that is this. Domestic workers actually were quite organized in Britain between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, when also in partly Thompson was doing the end actually of some of his analysis, the later analysis. So even though these workers, as I said, were creating organizations, trade unions, bringing together servants to fight for better working conditions and better pay. And they were also part of the suffragette movement. So they were together organizing for women's vote in the UK and being very active in that, in fact. Nonetheless, they do not appear as part of the feminist movement. So whenever we read narrations and reconstructions of the feminist movement, particularly in this very seminal period, which was the first wave of the fights for political rights and civic and later reproductive rights in the second wave of the feminist movement. So nonetheless, even if these women, I'm talking about organized women, I'm not just talking about women who work and domestic workers and who might not have, if you like, a class consciousness or consciousness of being a political subject. I'm talking about women who are actually organized and are fighting for their rights and fight also for gender justice. So even in these cases, they don't really appear as part of this movement. And that is, I mean, in many ways, as you probably know, it is because in large part of feminism has been portrayed from the outset as a movement that focuses on political rights, on civic rights, on reproductive rights. But when it comes to economic rights and class, in a way, there is much that's been neglected within. I mean, it's really the elephant in the room. I would say that class, as I said in a recent text, is really the elephant in the feminist room, because it's always there, but it's not discussed, particularly in, if you like, in some of the dominant strands. So, just to give you an example, there is not much work that's been done on the relationship between feminism and domestic workers. There is some remarkable work, but not that much compared to what actually could be done. But there is a recent article, very interesting, written by Julia J. Monat and a group of other authors, and they actually did a great job analyzing the political frames mobilized by both domestic workers and feminist movements in some 9 countries around the world. So it was a quite massive project. According to the authors of this study, while the political catchwords used by domestic workers activists often converge with those of feminist groups, so they tend to use the same slogans and the same catchwords sometimes, these convergences remain mostly, according to them, implicit and disconnected in practice. So most studies tend to emphasize the mixed encounters between feminist groups and domestic worker groups, but they all assume that they are separate entities. And this is really what, if you like, has driven mostly my research. Why do they have to be assumed as separate entities? Why the struggles of these women cannot be part of the narrative and of the history of the feminist movement and large? We will discuss that a little bit later. Now I want to talk to you about the empirical research that I did. It's really a pilot research, so it didn't last too long. I just wanted to test some of these ideas, and particularly the project was about understanding whether today's domestic workers organizations, so those organizing today, actually what relationship do they have to feminism? Do they consider themselves feminist? Do they fight with a feminist agenda? These were some of the questions that I asked. So just to give you a little bit of context again about this research project, it was conducted, I did desk review and in-depth interviews with domestic workers organizations in 4 countries. These were in Spain, UK, Mexico, and Brazil. And the main criterion to include organizations in the study was the level of significance that they had representing domestic workers in their specific national context, but also their direct and explicit engagement with feminism as visible from online materials. So I included only organizations that had some connection to feminism, that could be trace back, for instance, they could be seen in their websites, if they mentioned having been part of a feminist demonstration, if they mentioned doing some work like related to gender justice and against gender violence. So this was the criterion. So I did 20 interviews, and what comes out, I will tell you a little bit about the organizations. So these were the organizations that I interviewed, the members that I interviewed. In Spain, it was SEDOAC, Active Domestic Service, Servicio Doméstico Activo, that was founded in 2008 by a group of Latin American women. And Spain is a country with around 600,000 domestic workers, which is probably an underestimate, like in all of these countries, because, as you probably know, much of this work takes place in the black market, in which many of these workers don't have a regular contract, so they do not appear in statistics. So we are talking about official numbers that probably totally misrepresent reality. Spain is a country with a great number of domestic workers, particularly from the former colonies, from South America. In Brazil, I interviewed leading members of the National Federation of Domestic Workers, which is an association bringing together domestic workers associations in all of the country. And Brazil is one of the most important countries when it comes to studying domestic workers worldwide, because it's the country with probably the largest number of domestic workers. We're talking about 8 million. It's certainly the country with the largest number of domestic workers in Latin America. So, and this, for example, is an organization that the first of the organizations inside the federation was founded in 1936. So it's a very old organization, just as a testimony of the many years that these workers have been organizing. In Mexico, I interviewed the members of the National Union of Household Workers. Again, Mexico is again a country like all of Latin American countries, in which domestic work is a very important sector of employment for women, especially migrant women, indigenous women, and poor women from different parts of the country. And finally, I interviewed an organization in the UK, the Voice of Domestic Workers, that was founded relatively recently in 2009. But in the UK, there is a long tradition, as I said. My study, at least the theoretical part, was very much based especially on work in the UK. So the UK is a country in which domestic workers have been organizing really for more than a century. Now, one of the reasons why, maybe I should say also as to contextualize, one of the reasons why there are so many domestic workers and why these workers have become so active, particularly in the last 15 years, organizing through federations and mobilizing in different countries in very visible ways, is also linked to the foundation in 2008 of the International Domestic Workers Federation, which works quite closely with the International Labour Organization. And thanks to the lobbying work of this Federation of Domestic Workers, in 2011, they basically pushed for the ILO, the International Labour Organization, to pass a Convention 189, which is a convention basically that asks countries all over the world to sign a document in which they commit to make sure that domestic workers that domestic work is conceived as decent work, and that domestic workers are given the same rights as other workers in the country. This is actually not something very easy to achieve, as I'm sure it's the same in Greece as in other countries. These workers do not receive the minimum wage. Very often, as I said already, they don't receive any contract for the work they do. And therefore, obviously, they are not entitled to any benefits. This was particularly problematic during the recent pandemic, because in a country like the UK, for example, but I'm sure it was the same in other countries, they were one of the very few categories of workers that were not allowed any benefits, even in a context in which many categories of workers were entitled to benefits in a context in which they were losing employment and therefore losing wage. These workers simply could not demand that those benefits, because they did not appear anywhere. They were completely invisibilized by the fact that they tend to work in the black market. So I want to tell you a little bit about these interviews. As I said, when I did these interviews with these organizations, and I interviewed the leading members of these organizations, not because I wanted to, but simply because when I asked the organizations if they were willing to speak to me about their relationship to feminism and their organization more generally, I think they tended to choose some of the people who they believed could represent the organization in a more comprehensive way. So we ended up interviewing people who were usually part of the executive committee, or who in any case had leading roles. But this was not a decision on my part. It was more what happened because of the way they approached this research. So I just want to talk to you a bit some of the issues that come through these interviews. And I'm sorry, because I'm going to show you some very wordy slides. You don't have to read them, of course. I'm just going to give you the highlights. So the first issue that comes through very, very clearly in these interviews is the issue of race and colonial legacies. I would say this is like really number one. So all the members of the domestic workers organization, as I said already, in Spain, CEDOAC, for example, they are migrants, mostly from El Salvador and Paraguay, but also other countries. The same is true in the UK. The majority are migrants from different countries. Mexico, indigenous workers. In Brazil, they tend to be mostly Afro-descendants. So all the workers I interviewed, they were black. One man, and all the other ones were women. So just to give you an example, just from the first excerpt, this is Marilu from Mexico, from this organization, and she writes, one of the most important and relevant issues for household workers in Mexico is that of indigeneity, and where these women come from, the way that they dress, their traditions and native language. The Latin American media and television have also reinforced the stereotypes about household workers, for example, that they are backwards from the countryside, don't know how to read, and are ignorant and unintelligent. These stereotypes also serve to devalue and belittle household workers and their profession. So you can see it's very clear this, if you like, intersection between racial issues and class issues. They are ignorant, they are uneducated, they are poor, they come from specific parts of Mexico. So it is the issue of race and the issue of coloniality comes really quite strongly also in other excerpts, but it's also the issue of class. The last excerpt in this slide, the majority of domestic workers in Brazil are black women, but there is a small percentage of men that make up not even 5%. And again, those men are again black. I think that the second element that came through in these interviews is the relationship with feminism, which is a relationship very strongly mediated by class interests. So for these workers, even those who very strongly and clearly think of themselves as feminists, the issue that they have with some feminists is really the issue of class, is the issue that they do not represent their interests. And I want to read a little bit more about this because I think this is quite key and crucial for what I'm trying to say and the project I want to do. So for example, again, one of the interviewees in Spain, she says, in Spain, everyone talks about feminism, but non-white women and immigrant women like us are viewed differently within the feminist movement. And it is even more complicated for us. This is where the white feminist movement does not make sense to us. To talk about feminism in Latin America, we need more social justice and to improve people's lives in general. And Carolina, this is also quite interesting. On a personal level, she writes, I have felt discriminated against by the mainstream feminist movement for being poor, an immigrant, and a domestic worker. This is how I felt when I arrived. Now, after the fourth wave of feminism, it is a bit different because of the alliances that we have been creating. I remember that one of the first issues that I put forward during talks with feminists was that laws discriminate against us, society discriminates against us, our employers discriminate against us, and on top of all, the demands of white women are also what I fight. No, sorry, on top of all, feminism also discriminates against us. My struggles are not the same as the struggles of white women, but the struggles and the demands of white women are also what I fight for. A perfect example of this, you will have heard of La Manada, when a woman in Pamplona was gang raped by 5 men. This incident sparked outrage, and women all over Spain took to the streets to protest. We shared this outrage and participated in this protest. The 30th of March is the International Day of Domestic Workers, and we go together in the Plaza del Sol. Sorry. We go together in Plaza del Sol to protest for our rights as domestic workers. And who was there? We were the only ones. So where were the feminists? So this is just to give you a little bit, I mean, as anyone who does interviews, you know, we really like to read this material because it's incredibly rich and it tells us so much about these women's life experiences and struggles, really. But they are also very, very clear on what the issues are. So they are very clear that when it comes to feminist struggles, they are there because they feel those struggles are also their struggles, but they feel that their struggles as workers are not taken really as part of the struggles of the feminist movement at large. Now, the third issue that I want to raise is that of organizing, which is very, very important for all of these workers. It's very important because for them, organizing is a form of empowerment, consciousness raising, and struggle for rights. So all the women I interviewed described their discovery and participation in the organization and really the transformative experience that organizing has been. So I want to read you this one because I think this was quite remarkable. One of the things that, again, we learn as scholars working on migration and particularly gender and migration, is that very often it's quite a significant number of these women, particularly in the case of women who migrate alone. You know, there are different types of migration. Much of, or I would say a significant portion of female migration has been as so-called dependents for family reunification, particularly in the first wave of the feminization of migration. So between the late 70s and the late 80s, many women were joining usually their brothers or husbands in countries where they had already migrated. But that actually changes quite quickly. And there are lots of women who actually started to be the first to migrate to the country. In many of these cases, we are talking about women who have a university degree, to have a high level of education. So, migration is a quite selective process. Very often, it is actually not the poorest people who migrate because they cannot afford it. There is no way that they can actually move. It is often people who have at least some resources, depending on the country. So some of these women, this one is quite moving in a way because this is a woman from, I don't remember the country now, but she was a lawyer in her country. She moved to Spain to find a better job. And she couldn't. I mean, I want to just to say a little bit with her words because she also explains very well why organizing and fighting was so important to her. So she said, for 5 years, I worked as an internal domestic worker. This means a live-in, so she was living with the employer. So it was not just cleaning, it's also caring involved in this work, very often for an elderly person. For 5 years, I worked as an internal domestic worker, looking after the elderly and children, spending all day cooking, ironing, and cleaning. As a domestic worker, I was made to feel completely belittled and worthless. When I finally managed to stop working in domestic service, I found another job, which was as a research assistant for the Universidad Complutense in Madrid, conducting research about domestic work. Then I worked for the local municipality in Madrid, encouraging citizen participation. I started to feel valued again, and everyone began to treat me differently. I know that it's down to classism, but even now in the streets, people assume that I am a domestic worker. For 5 years, I have been a part of CEDOAC, fighting for the rights of domestic workers, and this is what has kept me from giving up or going crazy. Being a part of an organization and being part of the feminist struggle. These are the things that mean I keep my head above the water rather than drowning. Many women who are domestic workers and immigrants struggle to get through this, above all because of the awful way that they are treated, which has a huge impact on their emotional and mental health. And this is incredibly true. One of the things that really comes through so clearly in these interviews is the issue of mental health. These women feel so incredibly, really undervalued, made to feel worthless. They are called low-skill or unskilled labor. They are paid very little. They work many hours with no recognition. It takes a toll on you after a while. And the only thing, as she says, that really kept her alive even was fighting, was organizing, and helping other women to organize. I really want to go to my conclusions. I would keep reading forever otherwise, because I find them really so interesting. But let me really make some concluding remarks. So these are really initial explorations of more the contemporary relationship between domestic workers and feminism and the issue of class, which I hope to continue in a scaled up project. But I think that it seems to me that they show the importance of understanding the domestic workers movement as a feminist and working class movement. I think that the reason why this has not happened are obviously multiple and complex. I cannot really explore them in full now, but I would say that first, one of the reasons is that the working class continues to be thought of as male and white. So think, for example, I know this is not a local example, but in the UK, just to give you a little example, Brexit has been blamed on the white trash in the north. So again, this representation of these white men being angry about all these immigrants coming and taking the jobs. But again, this representation of these working class as being male and white. And in this case, also responsible for Brexit. So they get all the blame on top of being represented as this homogeneous group. Or think about how Trump's victory in the United States was again blamed on the Rust Belt's white workers. And the way they had apparently turned to the right. And actually, statistically, this is absolutely not true. It is not because of the way these working class voters voted that Brexit happened or Trump was elected. But in any case, I think that one of the reasons why these women really are erased from the labor movement and class analysis is because the kind of stereotype or narrative that the working class is really male and white is still very strong, even if there is lots of work actually trying to challenge this idea, of course. Secondly, I think the feminist movement continues to be dominated, at least politically, if not numerically, by white middle-class agendas. So obviously there have been huge advances in the last I would say 30 years. We now talk about feminisms in the plural, so certainly it's not just, there has been a huge challenge to white middle class feminism, particularly by intersectionality theory. in the sense that intersectionality, I think, has been very important in showing how, in challenging, for instance, ideas of universalism, of sisterhood, that were very much based upon the experiences of white middle-class women, in recentering particularly race. But at the same time, I think one of the, if you like, problems with intersectionality, not all of the, I mean, it's a huge and very heterogeneous paradigm, so I wouldn't say that it's all of intersectionality, but I would say some of maybe of the more academic and contemporary versions of intersectionality, they have tended to neglect class. So again, we have centered race, but class is still neglected. The third point for me is that the relationship between the workers' movement and the trade union movement is also a complex one, in which all the bureaucratized forms of organizing, the classical white male working class, are challenged by new forms of labor organizing. So again, there is lots of work to do when it comes to trade unions and organizing, and even they're going beyond the ideas of workers as being just traditional workers and male and white. And finally, of course, I think the issue is also to understand what we mean by working class. What does this mean today? Maybe I imagine there will be a discussion on this, but I just want to conclude by saying that I think it is really important to understand the role of these women in the feminist and in terms of class analysis, but also in the history of the feminist movement, because these women and these workers constitute a very, very significant section of the workers' movement. And one very important reason is also that we are talking about a sector that is going to grow. We are talking about a sector, in fact, that has very important specificities and unique features compared to other sectors, to other economic sectors, and is destined to grow because it is linked to really how neoliberalism has reconfigured our economies, our service economies. It is linked to the withdrawal of the welfare state and the ways in which these jobs are increasingly privatized and commodified, and people have to find carers or cleaners or people really to combine these works on the market. And this market very often is made of very poor women, migrant women. And it is a sector that is destined to grow because, the population is aging and there will be more and more need for people to take care of elderly people. So I am convinced absolutely that this is a sector of workers that is going to have a very, it's going to be of growing significance in the future of the labor movement. And if anything, I think this is a very important reason for taking it seriously and for making it part of our analysis and of our activism as well, of course, when we talk about class and feminism. Thank you for listening. Sorry it was a bit long.
Thank you a lot, Sara, for your great talk. So now it's time for questions. Who would like to ask something? Yeah, I have several, but from the audience. Questions. Okay, I will have one, and then other people will ask as well. So my question is a simple one. Do you think that that what you're describing, the neglect of this type of workers from the left-wing parties in the movement, has to do also with the nationalism that is, one of the aspects of several left-wing parties, and and that to a certain extent, especially the last decade, because it has been, especially the global north countries like Greece and Italy, etc., that these movements and parties have focused mainly on the locals or the natives rather than, to the immigrants. So if this is an aspect that explains this type of, but also about the feminist movement as well, that is, has prioritized, this type in locals, yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you. This is a very important question. Absolutely. I think you're right. I think, unwittingly and not consciously necessarily, but I think it definitely, when it comes especially to discussing, I would say, the more contemporary situation in which many of these workers are migrant, I think a certain nationalism of the center-left, there has always been, as we know, the labor movement in many ways has been plagued by nationalism, by a certain understanding of the interests that had to be defended as those of the national working class within these very within the national borders. So this is an old problem in many ways, in spite of the attempts by sections of the labor movement to be more internationalist, etc. But definitely this has been a problem, and I think the problem continues to this day. When we see parties from the center-left, social democratic parties, talking about immigration, definitely one of the problems is that they, at least in some countries, they have tended, in my view, to follow too much the right, in a way by assuming that voters are against migrants, that voters believe that migrants are taking jobs from nationals, they are lowering their wages. And because of these beliefs, there has certainly been a certain, when not open hostility, there has been a certain, if you like, timidity by these parties in defending very openly the rights of migrants. So I agree, I think this plays a role.
Yes.
Το μικρόφωνο παρακαλώ.
Just to address the issue about the negligence, the ignorance of outright workers, let's see other categories, from the other sex men. What about the chauffeurs, the drivers, or the horse who cares about the horses, or the tennis coaches? That also may be in the environment of this, in the household of a very rich man there. Or, you said that was another question about me, if it includes the cleaners in the factories. You said that it did include the cleaners in factories. Not only, sorry, the women who
Okay.
I said, maybe I said women who clean offices and hotels.
And factories?
Yeah, also, of course.
But yes, let's go to close to them are the men or women who may change the globe, the bulb, the electricians. They are not contribute to the main product of the factory, to the super value, to surpass the factory. But they are also, it's very close and a very similar job. The man who makes the furniture in this room, and the man and the women who cleans the room actually makes the same job. I would like to see if all of these categories, who are the limits of what we include in the local force, and what we are not included in the labor force. And finally, just a remark from my old history. I know that I was working in industry And some trade unionists also they did not call the cleaners as colleagues. In here in Greece,
Thank you.
traditional trade unionists and even left wing, they did not call the cleaners as big colleagues.
I don't understand.
Yeah, but I mean, that I mean, even in Greece, in trade union workers did not consider the women who were working in the factory as as their colleagues. As
Okay, okay. But manual work. I mean,
yes, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Do you want to take all the questions?
Maybe
or-
can we take a few?
Okay.
So yeah, and then I take.
Thanks. So I'm a classicist, I'm an ancient historian, so maybe my question is out of pure ignorance. But before that, you described this domestic workers movement as a real struggle for visibility. And I find this fascinating, the fact that a domestic worker in the household should be invisible, her work or his work should be visible, but at the same time, she or he, or it or whatever, should not be there, should not be visible in or leave evidence of its real human visibility. Anyway, so what I wanted to ask is this: can you please elaborate on the relationship between the domestic workers and feminism? That is, from the interviews you showed us, it seems that there is some sort of tension. They feel detached from the feminist movement. Why is that so? Because it seems that from what you described, this tension in the relationship has some sort of history. So why is that?
And there's another question over there. Sorry, there and then there.
Check this.
And then we'll stop and then Hello, and thank you very much for sharing your work. I'm not, I'm just a dancer, so my ignorance is gonna be even more than the one mentioned. I just happened to do a baby research in the framework of a master I did in anthropology on workers in the care work in hospitals. But there's a thing in Greece, you can ask for a, what's the name of, an exclusive nurse to take care of you when you're, which is private both, and some people can ask for it, like to be paid from their security insurance. And while interviewing this one Greek carer, how can I say the word, and one from I think was Ukraine, I found what you said, like this racism between the workers, that the local workers do it better, or the Ukrainian girls are, you know, somehow involved also in sexual services, which was a huge stereotype. And that's my question: if you met any of these stereotypes between the workers. That's one. And another thing that's in Greece, I think you can also say, the rest of you, that I found very interesting, that some people, the stereotype has certain nationalities for certain work, like Philippine women are good to take care of the babies. Women from the Soviet bloc are good to do the elderly, taking care of. Did you meet any of these stereotypes? Thank you.
There's just one more question and then we'll stop. I'd like to listen to them.
Hi. My question is a bit smaller. According to neo-Marxists, domestic workers are part of the workers who belong in the Labour Party, and they will bring the changes Marxism says, according to neo-Marxists? That's my question. We could say it's...
I will ask you the question again. How do you understand neo-Marxism?
Neo-Marxism, people who also believe in Marxism, but they are not as strict in Marx ideas, and they have also taken some, I could say, ideas, and they have evaluated the idea of Marxism in 21st century, for example.
Yeah, no, thanks for all these questions because they are very stimulating. Maybe let me start from the last one on neo-Marxism. I don't know if these I don't think neo-Marxists are working on domestic workers. So I would say that this is not a neo-Marxist how can I say, work or agenda in any ways, or reclassification of the working class in terms of valorizing domestic workers. So no, I don't think that has much to do with neo-Marxism in that sense. I mean, if you think of neo-Marxism in a more scholarly way, as a group, an actual group of scholars who have begun to identify themselves as such and who have been called neo-Marxists, particularly in the North American context. But on the other hand, if by neo-Marxism you mean a reading of Marx which is an immanent critique of aspects of Marx that he neglected or he didn't develop, but still working within a Marxian framework, then I would say yes, why not? And in that sense, I would say that social reproduction theory, in that sense, is an example of a form of immanent critique of Marxism and Marx's idea, and Marx's ideas, in the sense that social reproduction theory, for example, which is very important for this work on domestic workers, I didn't talk too much about that because it would have been too broad, but it's definitely, it starts from the acknowledgement that Marx recognized, or he saw somehow the importance of reproductive labor, such as domestic work, particularly the work done, for instance, by women within the working class household, but he did not develop an analysis of the role of this reproductive labor for the accumulation of capital. So in that sense, I would say, if you want to call neo-Marxist an immanent critique of Marxism today done by some Marxist feminists, yes, why not? The question on stereotypes, absolutely, yes. There are so many stereotypes, so I think what you saw is, I mean, there are some commonalities. For example, I guess it also depends on the country, but I remember that, for example, in Italy, for a long time, Filipino workers were one of the favorite category of domestic workers because they are Catholic, and so there was the idea that there was some kind of cultural affinity and religious affinity between these women and the Italian population. So the idea was, you know, we can trust these women and bring them into our houses because they are Catholic like us. They are docile. There were also lots of racist stereotypes about these Asian women being particularly docile and not creating troubles, etc. There are definitely these stereotypes, and definitely there is racism also among workers and between workers, which I would say is not just a feature of domestic workers or migrant care workers. I would say that you find it, generally speaking, among the working class, and which is, if you like, something that is very much driven by, I mean, it's it's something that it's kind of designed in a way by employers. There is very much an attempt to divide the working class, to divide workers, to make sure that they don't organize, they don't talk too much. I mean, in the case of domestic workers, obviously, in a way, the problem is not the same because they are, as she said, invisible and they are isolated. So they work alone in a house. So the only way really they have to connect to other workers and organize is outside their workplace. But in the case of hospitals or care homes, definitely, I'm actually now doing also just these weeks. This is part of also, I should say, a research project on care and domestic workers, because I'm interested in the working conditions of migrant workers in the UK in general doing this work. And it's also very mixed, because when we talk about domestic workers, now in this talk today, I was focusing on those employed in private household. But, you know, these are also care workers very often, because even in private households, very often they take care of children, they can take care of elderly people, or often they have multiple jobs. There are some care workers that might work for a couple of days in a care home, and the other days they work cleaning households. And sometimes this is due to the visa restrictions they have. There are cases of, for instance, in the UK, if you are on a student visa, you can only work 20 hours a week officially. And so I found that some of the women I interviewed as care workers, so working in care homes, officially care homes, they were working just 2 days a week. But the other days, 2 days a week, they would be working as cleaners in private household, because those hours, they would not appear officially. And so they can do it without having visa problems. So, but this is just to say, there are certainly many stereotypes. And in care homes, actually, this is what I wanted to say. These care workers said very explicitly that employers do not want them to chat among themselves. They keep them separated, and they create such brutal, really, working conditions that these workers start to really hate each other, because it's those conditions, it's the constant being understaffed, having to do the work of somebody else because that somebody else might be off sick for a day. So it's really these very inhumane working conditions that create also that kind of breeding ground, if you like, for forms of stereotyping and even racism. But yes, definitely stereotypes are very present. I agree. You asked why they are detached from the feminist movement. I mean, this is really my question, in the sense that I think they are part of the feminist movement. I think they are feminist, and my project in a way is to recognize how this is also feminism. But certainly there is a certain, can I say, a certain idea of feminist struggles as being those focused on political rights or on reproductive rights. And in that sense, and also in many ways, the struggles of feminism or the significations of feminism have been for a long time linked to middle-class movements and middle-class demands. So in that sense, they feel detached because they feel that those demands don't speak to them. So for example, they are not concerned about breaking the glass ceiling because they are cleaning floors. They are not even getting close to this ceiling, just to say. And there is so much talk about the glass ceiling. They are not concerned about the so-called pink quotas, because again, it's something they don't, it's not a conversation they're part of. So in that sense, they feel detached because they feel that those demands do not speak to them, they don't represent them. That's why I said, I would say that even in their discussions, it's very clear that class, there is a big class divide for them. I mean, just to give you an example, which is I always found really, really interesting. You know, in Brazil and in Bolivia, in Bolivia during the Morales government, they were very close. Actually, they did make law, so turning really implementing Convention 189, which was the one I mentioned earlier. So in Bolivia, they try to seriously implement it by making sure that workers could have a regular contract, were entitled to certain rights, etc. And interestingly, in that occasion, in Parliament, some of the women, self-proclaimed feminists, voted against, because they are the same women who employ domestic workers. And so for these women, it's not convenient to have workers who suddenly start to demand more money, because they're very happy to have this very cheap labor. And in that sense, it's entirely a class issue. So these women might well be feminists when it comes to certain issues. When it comes to recognizing the rights of these domestic workers, their interests are conflicting. So I would say that it's definitely a detachment due to a class divide. And your question on on classification, if I understood you correctly, you said why not those workers who change the bulb, etc. No, my point is not that those workers are not important. I'm just, I would say, when it comes to class, I think it's a political discussion. Class is a political classification. It's, and in that sense, and it is a political discussion. So in that sense, the reason why I am focusing on this segment of the workforce is because they are very numerically significant. They have been neglected historically, and the large majority of them, more than 90%, are women.
Okay, I will ask about you. I'm sorry, I didn't ask how you reject them, but if Marx also ignores other categories in household, like the teachers who teach the babies, the nannies, the driver, the chauffeur, the housekeepers, the horse keepers. I mean, is it if it were a matter of job, a matter of sex, or a matter of having a fringe role? If it were that because all of them said they had a fringe role in the production.
Okay, I understood better. I think for Marx, yeah, in a way, he thought that they were irrelevant to what mattered, which was what he called the productive working class, namely productive workers in factories producing things that had not just a use value, because they could be sold on the market. So in that sense, these domestic workers, these servants, had a fringe role for him. But what I'm saying is that it's a mistake to consider them on the fringe, because there were so many. And actually, maybe the role should be rediscussed.
Rosa.
Thank you. Sara, thank you so much. You know, I had some thoughts. I'm not sure if this is a question, but it's mostly a thought I want to share with you. It is my impression that domestic work in particular, not any type of cleaners, but domestic work that happens within the realm of the household. And in that case, it's invisible in that sense. It's private and it's open to abuse. It's open to all sorts of things that public work is not. I think that by definition, this work is part of class identification. How many people do we know who either they self-identify, well, most people we know who self-identify as middle class, or they're de facto by their income or their cultural capital working class, they do employ someone who clean their house. Having someone to take care of living, essentially, of what is basic, you know, having your house clean, having your clothes ironed, having your food made for you, taking care of your kids, taking care of your parents when they grow old. That's a class thing. That's something that only the middle class is doing by using the working class. So I don't know, it is my impression that it is very central in class identification. It may be not central in terms of capital accumulation. We can discuss that, because what allows capital to accumulate in certain ways could be based on that. But my question is deeper, in the sense it's like existential. It's a form of identity for the middle class to use someone to do this work for you. So I hear, and you know, I'm including everyone in this discussion, how do you overcome this when by class position you are using someone who is doing that work from you, whether you identify politically as a feminist or as a communist or as a Marxist or as a socialist or as center-left, you name it. But there is, and it seems to me, I agree with you, that class is the elephant in the room in many ways, not just for feminism, but for left politics. So that's my thought.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you, and it's a very complicated issue, because I don't know about Greece, but in a country like Italy, and maybe to some extent even in the UK, I'm not completely convinced that only the working classes are employing domestic workers. I mean, let me explain better. So in a country like Italy, for example, there is a phenomenon that instead of developing, for instance, more public care homes, what the state has done over the last 40 years was actually to promote care at home. So elderly people tend to stay at home. It's also a cultural thing. They don't want to go to care homes, they want to stay with their families, etc. But obviously, in a context in which especially women are no longer staying home with their parents to take care of them, as it might have happened until, I don't know, 30 years ago. So what's happening in Italy now is that the state gives elderly people who are no longer independent, it gives an allowance, which is something, it's like less than 1,000 euros. So what families are doing, even working class families, is they use this money to hire a migrant worker who is both a domestic worker but also an elderly carer and lives with the elderly person. So what they might do is that, and this is precisely because these women tend to work for even less than 1,000 euros. And a care home costs much more than that, because the majority of them have been privatized. So this is to say that I think it's very complex. And in the end, I think it is true that the majority of families hiring domestic workers, for instance, just to clean for a few hours, they might well be middle classes. But here again, there is a problem when you might be in a household with two incomes, both parents, for instance, with small children working, you know, I don't know, 40 hours a week. And it is an issue. And there have been some solutions in other countries in which, for example, like in a country like Belgium, the state gives a voucher to the family that can be used to hire a cleaner. But the cleaner in that case is employed by the municipality, and so she is an actual worker entitled to a contract, entitled all benefits, so she is more treated as, I mean, obviously it's not perfect, but she's more of a professional worker, and the employer is not the individual family, but is the municipality. So I think, personally, this is, in many ways, I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's a much better solution than leaving it to the private market. Because what these workers are asking, for example, these domestic workers that I interviewed, they are not saying, I don't want to do this. I don't know if they want or not. I didn't ask them explicitly if they want to do this job or not. But what they're saying all the time is, our work is not recognized as skilled. What we do is not recognized as something that requires experience, skills, dedication, and what they do is to have really that recognition. And in that sense, I would say that it would be much better if they were employed, for example, by, you know, a municipality or by, in that case, yes, by as public servants in the public service, rather than being left to this wild private market.
Thank you. It just there was also an older discussion. I remember some of the discussions of the Black liberation movement and the Black Panthers, where they were discussing exactly about that and how important it is for the feminist movement and for political liberation to separate domestic work from, you know, that privatized, that use of a person, you know, to have a kind of like cleaning service that would be constructed in some ways as a public service, or in some other ways as a company, or in ways that would detach it from the person in that sense. I mean, you mentioned Italy. In Greece, we don't have a similar system, but there has been a period, and especially in the good years, in the 80s and the 90s, when everybody who could afford would hire or a Filipino domestic worker, because that was a class marker as well. It was not just for someone to do the work. It was because you could afford it and you would automatically belong, and that would be a kind of like symbol of belongingness to that class. So that's why it's not just, I think, you know, just to, you know, re-elaborate on what we are discussing. It's not just a symbol of like who belongs to what class. It's also an aspiration. You know, when you aspire to kind of like cross that border between the working class and the middle class.
Who else would like to ask something? I think questions. So I have another one. So how do you think that, for example, social reproduction theory could be useful for your project or similar project, or how this theory has been used in order to analyze this type of phenomena that you analyze today?
Yeah, no, this is a very important question. I think social reproduction theory is really very important in this context because, you know, these workers, what they are doing really is they are reproducing the labor power, they are reproducing the workforce, and they are really contributing to the reproduction of society in general. So that's why I would say that one of the main theoretical frameworks for this project is definitely social reproduction theory, which tries really to say very simply that if we want to understand the complexities of capitalism and the ways in which capitalism not only accumulates but reproduces, we need to understand the work that these women do in private households, in care homes, the various and multifarious ways in which children and workers are reproduced. So in that sense, the domestic workers are reproductive workers, absolutely. And as I said, I talk about domestic workers because these are domestic workers organizations that like to call themselves this way. But you know, what these workers do is not, as I said, is not just cleaning, it's caring, caring for children, caring for elderly people, taking care of, you know, somebody's private place and somebody's most, you know, precious things and places. So in that sense, is definitely very important for this project.
Thank you. Yeah, behind the mic.
Thank you. Yeah, so the question might be very basic, but you just said that these workers, immigrant workers, domestic workers, are excluded from both the worker movement and the feminist movement, but maybe for the worker movement, I can kind of understand it because you have the unions that officially represent, so they can give an image of the worker. But who defines what is the feminist movement, and are they excluded from what? And yeah, I'm just trying to understand whether the definition comes from some official feminist groups or how feminists are seen in the public eye, which might be a bit problematic because we kind of define the movement through the eyes of the other side, kind of.
No, thank you. That's very relevant. It's not basic at all. It's actually really, really crucial. I would say there is not an official definition of the feminist movement. I would say that even talking in the singular is probably problematic in many ways. What does it mean, the feminist movement? We use this word, but obviously it's very, very complex. So I would say that when I use this concept, I'm doing it in a very general way, which obviously whatever I develop and write, I would be very careful to clarify. But I'm using here in this context to talk about what has come, if you like, in the mainstream to be understood as the feminist movement, as that constellation of feminist struggles and feminist groups who are brought together by some key struggles and fights. Fights against gender violence, fights for political rights, fight for reproductive rights. I would say that these have been the keystones, really, of the feminist movement, by which I mean the various struggles of feminists over the last 100 and something years. Then, of course, the history of feminism, feminist struggles is much more complex. I agree with you. But usually in the majority, I would say, of reconstruction, even in the mainstream, when we talk about the feminist movement, now what have we talked about in the last, 5 years? Me Too, for example, was considered to be one example of the feminist movement, again, reawakening, or there has been lots of talk about how everyone now is a feminist and how the feminist movement is very strong because there has been a mainstreaming of feminism, all these pop stars, rock stars calling themselves feminist. So this is what I'm referring to. If you like, it's more a kind of mainstream idea of feminism. But even in the more scholarly and more refined, if you want, reconstruction of the feminist movement, when you talk about the first wave, the second wave, the third wave, which is in itself very problematic, but nonetheless, even in these reconstructions, again, the focus tends to be on the fights, particularly of white middle-class women in that period. So, for example, the first wave is dominated by the fights for the right to vote. The second wave in the 60s, 60s and 70s, is dominated by the fight for reproductive rights and for civic rights and against gender justice. So this is just to say, in all these narratives, class is there because obviously there are groups within the history of feminism and the feminist movement at large who have always posed the class issue. But I would say that it's been quite marginalized. That is more my point.
Yeah, thank you. Just to follow on the question on social reproduction, we tend to use class in two ways. One is simply exploitation. The other has to do with, let's say, the inner dynamic of the capitalist mode of production. Probably the reason Marx did not include domestic workers is that he felt that they were not crucial for the actual workings of the capitalist mode of production the way he conceived it. The question we should ask is, to what extent domestic workers are the function they are doing, the economic function, their economic function, is important in the present day workings of capitalism. Not necessary. I mean, that's a question with social reproduction. Of course, the reproduction of society is a necessary prerequisite for everything else to function. But within the workings of the mode of capitalism, this was not necessary in the 19th century, probably still not necessary. It's built on already existing modes of reproduction and so on. So today, are domestic workers critical for capitalism, or it's simply one of the many ways exploitation continues to exist, but in a peripheral area, which is not critical in a sense?
I would say that, well, they are not, I would say, a sector that works in a peripheral area that is insignificant. I would say that they are one of those categories of workers who are critical to capitalism, just as I would say the majority of so-called workers in the gig economy. Because these are the workers of today's capitalism. They are precarious, they are unpaid, they are paid very little, they tend not to be entitled to a number of benefits. So in that sense, I would say they belong to that constellation of workers who work in the so-called gig economy. And in that sense, they are crucial, not alone. I'm not saying that, that they will be the vanguard of future revolution. I mean, maybe they will be, I don't know. But this is just to say that they certainly belong to that constellation of workers that are very, very important for capitalism now. And what is particularly important, in my view, about these workers, not just, again, I focus today on domestic workers, but I think it's really important to understand that they are one section of socially reproductive workers. And what I think increasingly is that domestic workers, together with care workers and social reproduction workers, are going to have a major role increasingly in the future struggles. And I think this is already becoming more and more clear after the pandemic. I mean, I'm talking about the UK, so my perspective is very focused on the country where I live now, not even the country where I'm from, which is Italy, but the country where I now live, that I'm studying for this project. So to give you an example, after the pandemic, so in the last 12 months, there have been many strikes in the UK, and for the first time in its history, nurses have gone on strike. Care workers in care homes have gone on strike. Domestic workers, this is one of the problems. They can strike, but obviously, because of the way they're organized, it has different repercussions and different significance. Even though they also went on strike, for example, in Spain, there has been a major demonstration with lots of domestic workers going on strike on the 8th of March. But this is to say, they are part of that segment of social reproduction workers, like care workers, like teachers, like nurses, domestic workers, that I think are going to be key in future struggles. And this, in my view, is already becoming quite clear. So yeah, that I would answer this way.
Yes, thank you. The mic too, yeah.
Thank you for presenting your work. I was wondering to what extent the organizing of domestic workers and their demands are highlighting or even aiding some ideas that have been put in the public dialogue related to, in general, to caregivers, especially mothers, in the traditional way, as unskilled or unpaid workers without social security and largely unrecognized. Okay, in a feminist point of view, one of the feminists' point of view, it could be viewed as women being enslaved by men, working for free. But we don't need to go there. But I've heard that in some countries there has been discussion about mothers having social security just because although in fact they have benefits. Are these two movements interconnected in some way in the point that they are about caretakers in the domestic sector, for instance?
May I add something on this? Yeah, so I have a question that is related to the one that was asked. So my question is that, have you found anything that, from a theoretical perspective, from the work of Della Costa or Federici, that could help you, to highlight and to analyze this? Because, I mean, one of her proposals was, to focus on the domestic labor. And yes. And also, if you, okay, this is too much. So, if you have an insight on how the feminists of the Communist Party of Italy perceived these type of issues back in the 1970s and 80s, I mean, when there was, other trends of other feminist approaches to this kind of, yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking exactly about Dalla Costa and Selma James when you mentioned benefits and social security for mothers, you said, and women. So, I mean, first, maybe if I'm not sure I understood your question correctly, but one thing to say is that, and this is what social reproduction theory, which again is a broad church and includes the work of Maria Rosa Dalla Costa, Selma James, Silvia Federici, but also Titi Bhattacharya, Sue Ferguson. So really it's quite a broad constellation of feminists who share the position on focusing on the importance of reproductive labor, but there are also differences between them. But just to say, what they share and what they explain is that one of the key reasons why domestic work, care work, is so undervalued in our societies, paid very little, considered unskilled, it is because historically it is associated with the unpaid work of women, which goes completely undervalorized under capitalism. So this, I think, is a very important insight of social reproduction theory. And in that sense, I think it is very true that it is precisely because of this association with feminine work, which is supposedly vocational, so women apparently are born with these non-skills, right, with this vocation. So that's why this work, for many years, it was not even considered as work as such. And so in that sense, I think the Selma James and Maria Rosa Dalla Costa, for those of you who don't know, in the 1970s in Italy, but also in other countries in the United States and in the UK, they launched a campaign called Wages for Domestic Work. And what they wanted to do was precisely to show, I mean, it was in many ways a polemical proposal to show that domestic work done in unpaid form by housewives and women in the household is work, and so it should be entitled a wage. Now, I think that that work was incredibly important in those years. It was making a very important point about precisely recognizing that it is work. And in many ways, now it is, if you like, their ideas have been, I mean, at least their point that this is work has been vindicated in the sense that, yes, many women are doing it as work. Many women, in fact, are paid as cleaners, carers, domestic workers, housekeepers, etc. The problem is that they have a wage, but this wage is very low. And the working conditions are very low. And even if this work is now recognized as work, still it is recognized as unskilled work, and work that really does not you know, it shouldn't be entitled to many of the benefits that other workers have. So in that sense, obviously, there is still a major obstacle and problem, I would say.
Thank you. Thank you, Sara, for the wonderful talk. A small comment, I guess, or a question that relates to our discussion right now, and that's to do with a recent critique by Maurizio Lazzarato on the social reproduction theory. He's saying that, in fact, we need to see the work of women not as reproduction, I mean, the domestic work of women, but as production. And I'm thinking that this could be actually a very, very interesting insight to follow, and I think it strengthens your argument of the importance of domestic work. He focuses more on the unpaid domestic work. And he says that's, you know, the problem is that we see it as a kind of secondary because it does the reproduction of the waged worker who is going to go out and produce. But if we see production of value, not necessarily commodities, but value as essential in that work, then I think that's actually, you know, valorizes further and foregrounds that work as essential, as you said, for capitalism today. And I was wondering, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I would say that Lazzarato here is probably a little bit, I'm not sure I agree entirely with that, in the sense that I think it's important to understand still that this work, there are differences between this work and factory work, or really work that is, if you like, involved in the accumulation and valorization of capital in terms of creating surplus value. I mean, in the sense, I would say that it's important to understand what type of work we are talking about. So I'm saying in the case of what he says, unpaid work, that's where I'm not sure I agree. In the case of paid work, I would say that it depends on where this work takes place and the ways in which it takes place. So for example, care workers employed by care homes, which are owned by large corporations, sometimes international corporations, that is definitely work that is productive of value in a very clear way. These workers are really you know, enabling these capitalists to make huge returns. So I would say that it really depends, because this is really quite variegated work as well, and I think it needs to be seen. I mean, Lazzarato is very interesting. I think he wants to be a bit provocative, if you like, but I think it's definitely an interesting insight.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that in that book he couples the unpaid domestic work with the work of enslaved people, you know, starting with, you know, the middle passage. So, you know, that's, as you say, a very provocative thought, but I thought it was worth thinking further. Thanks.
You know, it's not that far from truth in some cases. I don't know again about Greece, about what's happening, what I'm discovering in the UK. Just to give you an example, these migrant domestic workers, we are really talking about unfree labor in some cases. Because, you know, in 2012, the Home Office in the UK approved a new visa for domestic workers, according to which they could enter the country they could stay for 6 months, and they had to undergo a very complex process for renewal. But during those 6 months, their passport, they basically could work only for the employer. So they could not change employer. So they entirely depended on the employer. So there were lots of, you know, fights. In fact, the organization Voice for Domestic Workers in the UK is completely focused on that. We are talking about women who are fighting precisely, you know, these very unjust laws. So now it's changed. It's no longer like that. Now they can change the employer, but the conditions are still ridiculous, because they have only 6 months to find a new employer, and if they don't, they are kicked out of the country. So what happens sometimes is that some of these women, they overstay their visa, and so they are officially illegal in the UK. And they obviously, it happens because 6 months sometimes were not enough to find a new employer. Sometimes we're talking about very traumatized women who left the employer because they were abusing them in different forms. So they couldn't immediately find another employer. They are taken into, you know, a refuge for victims of violence, etc. So sometimes these women, the lawyers advise them to apply for asylum, to become refugees, because they say it's the easiest way for you to try to stay in the country, but they refuse because they say, if I become a refugee, then I cannot go back to my country, and they might have children left behind. So these are incredibly complex situations, and this is a situation of unfree labor. And I can go on because the care homes are doing exactly the same. So now, you know, because of Brexit, until a few years ago, many carers in care homes, but also domestic workers, etc., they were coming from Eastern Europe. Since Brexit, there are fewer and fewer women, obviously, coming from Eastern Europe, but there is a huge shortage for care workers in hospitals, in care homes, huge turnover. They need they need workers on a daily basis. So what's happening is that now, because of the incredible shortage, the UK has issued a few years ago a new visa, which is a special visa for health and care workers. So what they do is that they recruit workers, particularly from former colonies and English-speaking countries, because these workers need to be able to speak English, from the Caribbean,
East Africa.
Exactly, India, Nepal, etc. But what's happening is that their contract, in many cases, this is what I'm discovering really these weeks, their contracts requires them, they cannot leave their employer, they can, but if they do leave the employer within the first year, they have to pay back 90% of the recruitment fees. If they leave the second year, is 50%. In the third year, so again, this is unfree labor. This is entirely unfree labor. And so in that sense, I would say it's an interesting...
Connection, thank you.
Yes.
I would like to ask you, first of all, I would like to comment on the last one you just said about the visas. If you are from the working class and you are going for work somewhere else, then they give you a visa for some months. But if you want to, you are a big investor, for example, and you want to invest your money with the ways we all know they invest their money, then they give you the golden visa to become an EU citizen. The golden visa to become an EU citizen, for example. And this has to do also with the Airbnb situation, but something out of this matter. But yes, okay. I would like to comment and ask you about two things. The one is you said that it was not considered as work, and I believe that it was considered and is still considered as a modern form of slavery with minimum wages and devaluation of human beings. Following also from the previous questions that I heard here, and also from Rosa's question about how essentially was in the past to have someone, a housekeeper, and how this had to do with a higher social status, like getting an object, buying a car, or having a pool, swimming pool. I would like to ask about the issue of violence, both physical and psychological, which these women are subjected to by their employers. Wait, because I lost my question. Yes, about the issue of dehumanization and objectification by their employers, which is also, in my opinion, is a kind of political violence in the sense of class stratification. Usually the employer is of the upper social class, while the employee, okay, the modern slave, which does not have any rights, even, of course, not if it is in a country like Britain, as you said, but here in Greece, we know that is mostly black labor. So yes, please.
Yes. Well, I would say that not all employers are necessarily violent or abusive in the sense that, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is that definitely this is a sector in which many women have spoken about situations of abuse and violence. Sometimes we're talking about sexual violence or, you know, violence, they are beaten and terrible things really happen to them. This does happen. And obviously this does happen because, you know, there is a total devaluation of these workers. It's really the conditions that in a way allow, you know, violent employers to act in this way. So this definitely happens. I don't know what is the percentage of women who are subjected in the sector to this type of violence. I would not say it is the majority. But the point I'm trying to make is that, you know, they might, some of them say, you know, my employer was really nice. They were kind, they, you know, treated me nicely. But at the same time, I felt very undervalued and my work was still shit and my wage was still rubbish. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that definitely it is a type of work that creates the conditions for violence and abuse to happen, precisely because it is so invisibilized and unprotected. But at the same time, even when the employer is kind, or when the employer is not abusive, I think it's important to recognize it's a social relation. The employer-employee relation in this case is a social relation in which there are important power dynamics that go even beyond the best intentions of the employer. So you might have a very good employer, but the power dynamic is still there and it's not going away because, you know, still you are employed, underpaid, and subjected to that relation of oppression. So I think it's also, yeah, I guess it's important to understand it goes even, beyond the specific relationship between that employer and that worker. But yeah, I don't know percentages in terms of how many women are subjected to. Definitely it is, there is a number of them and you know, we know because they denounce it and there are also organizations, for instance, in the UK that defend their rights and they help them to denounce these employers and flee these situations. So yeah, definitely it's a phenomenon that it's happening.
Any other question? Yes.
Okay. Hello, Sara. So you talk about violence not being, in your observation, or at least in your educated guess, not being seen in the majority of cases of domestic work. But you didn't, I think it's a good time to stop and define violence, because some of the things you talked about as being the baseline for domestic workers, like being undervalued for their labor, being their labor being seen as something unskilled, them being underpaid, them not having employment rights. I think that can very well be seen as a form of violence, and that sort of power dynamic does not only the sort of power dynamic of, especially when it comes to live-in workers, that sort of power dynamic of the employer who is also your landlord, in a sense, is not just a breeding ground for violence, it's sort of built on a sort of violence. That situation of you work for me, you sleep in my house, you take care of my children. No matter how nice your employer may be, that sort of restriction, and combined, of course, with the absence of labor rights, of any any outside force you can go to and say, I'm being mistreated, I'm being discriminated against, I'm not being paid enough, which is, of course, absent in this sort of black market labor that we're discussing right now. That, I think, is in itself a very real form of violence, because being, like you mentioned, and the interviews you mentioned the mental health toll of being undervalued, underpaid, and having your skills brushed off as something you can innately do, especially in terms of female domestic workers, which is of course the majority. So I would say that, in fact, if we loosen our definition of violence a bit to extend further than what we would call an attack, a verbal attack, a physical attack, a sexual attack, then I think the majority of domestic care workers would report violence, especially those that work entirely, under the radar, untaxed. Like the majority of domestic workers, like you said, the numbers you gave us are underrepresenting, because a lot of the people who work as domestic workers are undocumented, and their work is undocumented as well. So my question is, if we loosen the parameters a bit, wouldn't we see that the majority of these people have experienced violence?
Well, yes, definitely. If we define violence in the way that you did, I completely agree. And in many ways, I would say that even if we keep a stricter definition of violence as attack of some form, but in any case, I would say the large majority of these women experience forms of abuse in that sense. And in fact, the issue of mental health is huge. It's completely underreported, but it's absolutely huge in these cases. And no one talks about it because it's just why it is, obviously, the idea is, of course, your job is not great, so you might not be exactly happy, but it goes it goes really beyond that. We are talking about situations of deep depression, women who, are really going through very serious problems of mental health because of these working conditions. So yeah, I would say I agree with you.
So, thank you a lot. 1 minute. Our next talk is 1 week from now, next Friday. We have another feminist with us, Dimitra Giannaki. The title of her talk is "This is Not Gender, from eugenic post-liberal modes of governmentality towards republic." Thank you, and see you next Friday. Thanks, Sara. Yeah, thank you, Sara, a lot for your talk.